application in the Kubernetes cluster using the UI itself. In UI itself, you can bring up application, okay? But the options are limited. Let's see that. So on the top right hand corner, you can see a plus icon. There, you have two options. One is create from an input. You can write the direct YAML file here, or from file, you can write a YAML file and upload it there, and you can create a deployment here. Or otherwise, they have a form available to create a deployment and map it with the service. Okay, so they have this option. This is the only option you with the form-based option to create a application in it. Okay, so before going into it, let me identify a Docker which I will be using for the lab. So let me use a Nginx Docker. So Nginx is a web server. So when I run this container, it will by default show a default Nginx page, and there I will play around with that Nginx image. So I will use this image. Okay. And let me walk you through the options you can see when you want to create from a form. Okay. The first and foremost thing is the application name. So this is where you are going to tell what is the deployment name. Okay. So as I explained earlier, whenever you create an application, first you are going to create a deployment. The deployment will create a replica set, and the replica set will be creating the actual pods or nothing but the containers, right? So first, let me name the deployment. So let me call it as my first app. My first app, let me call it as my first app. Then I need to provide the image, what I should be using for it. Okay, so here I'm going to use the Nginx image. Let me use that. And next, I need to tell how many pods are running. So this is where you are going to define the horizontal scaling of the application. So let me say I want 4 Nginx containers to be running. That means I want 4 pods to be created for the deployment. So let me name it as 4. Okay. And the next input is service. In the service, there are 2 options available. One is called as the internal service, and another one is called as the external service. Internal service is something like when you expose a deployment as an internal service, only the applications within the cluster will be able to access that. Okay. And next one is called as the external service. When you create external service, applications which are outside of the clusters can be accessing that. So normally when you expose the external URL, you'll be exposing this as an external service. Okay. And my Kubernetes cluster is pre-configured to communicate to my Amazon load balancer, and it will automatically provision a load balancer, and that will be mapped to my machine in which the containers are running, containers or pods are running. We'll see that example. Prior to that, let me just show my Amazon. This is my region where I can see there is only 2 load balancers available, one for my batch 1 and one for the current batch. Okay. So when I host this application, my Kubernetes will communicate to my Amazon. It will create a load balancer here. We'll see that once we come back. Okay. So I'm going to expose this application as an external service. So when I select it, it is going to ask me for the port mapping. Port mapping is something like what port the load balancer should be listening and what port it should be connected to the container. I know that my container will be listening on port 80. So I want my load balancer should also listen on port 80. So I'm doing the port mapping like 80 should be mapped to the 80 of my container, and the protocol should be TCP. Okay. So this is the port mapping for the service. So these are all the mandatory information for a container to be deployed on Kubernetes. Adding to that, there are some advanced options. Let me just walk you through that. Okay. The first thing is description. You can write a small description about this deployment. This is basically a write up about this particular deployment. And then I told you labels are very important feature in Kubernetes, right? Only with the labels, you'll be mapping the service with the actual deployment, right? So those things you can define. So there is bare minimum one label needed for a deployment. So it is taking my application name as a one label. So it is already pre-configured the one label. I need minimum one label for the application for a deployment. Next is on which namespace I want this application to be deployed. So I want it to be deployed on the default namespace. That's okay. And next is image pull secret. Imagine you are storing your container as a private registry. In that case, without a username and password, you will not be able to access the container, right? So that is where this image pull secret comes into picture, where you can store the Docker Hub username and password, and using that username and password, Kubernetes will pull the image. Okay. And next line is your CPU requirement. Like for example, in Docker, we have seen how to restrict the CPU for the container or memory for the container. If you want to provide that, you can provide it here, CPU and memory. And next is when you provide a container, we have talked about entry point and CMD, right? If you want to pass any arguments, okay? If you want to pass any run commands, you can provide it. Or for the run commands, if you want to pass any arguments, you can provide it. And then if you want to pass any environment variables, you can pass it here. Okay. And adding to that, if you want to run this container as a privileged container, like for example, your kubectl proxy should be running as a privileged container because it is going to communicate with the network of the host machine, right? Like kube proxy should be running as a privileged container. If you are running any container which has to have a interaction with the underlying operating system, then you will run this as a privileged container. So these are all the options you can provide. I haven't changed anything in the form. I have put the app name as my first app, image I'm using Nginx, and number of pods is 4, and the external it should be external service 80 and 80. So these are all the informations I'm giving. So let me deploy the application. So once I deployed, I can see one deployment is created. So currently it is coming up. That's why it's saying 0 out of 4. And it would have created a replica set. You can see the replica set 1 out of 4. So now it is 4 out of 4. That means my application is running. And then I would see 4 pods are running. If you notice the IP address or the node IP in which it is running, 2 pods are running in one node and 2 pods are running in other node because my cluster has 1 master and 2 nodes. Okay. And then yeah, it would have created a service. If you see the service with the same deployment name, it is creating a service, and you see it is having an external endpoint. Okay. If I go to this load balancer and refresh, I can see that there is a load balancer got created, and this is pointed to my nodes. Okay. So as the container is running on 2 different nodes, both the nodes are mapped to it. And if I go to my dashboard and try to access the URL, okay, this may take some time because it's a new DNS, right? It will take some time to update the DNS. Within a minute or 2, it should be up. Let's wait for that. Yeah, it's up now. So you can see the default Nginx page here.